All right, we are now recording our next Zoom session. We're looking at Unit 3 in Acoustics 110. And Unit 3 is on the topic of complex sounds. We'll spend a couple of weeks on this topic. And this is the final unit that we cover before the midterm exam. So we'll cover it in detail. We'll take our time. But so far, we've covered in Unit 1, frequency, wavelength, speed of sound. Took a few weeks to do that. Then we covered for 2 weeks the decibel from hell, intensity and the decibel. So those are two main dimensions of sound, frequency and intensity. And now what we're looking at here is complex sounds. We're putting things now together in more real life situations. So the main sound of interest we care about is speech. And so we're going to be looking at some of the aspects of speech as a complex sound, because speech is what hearing aids are all about. People want to hear speech. And what is it about speech that way? So let's go share screen and go to our lovely notes here. And you'll see this: complex sounds, filters, noise, speech. And read with me from the top here. Almost all sounds we hear are complex. Complex sounds are combinations of many different frequencies. Each frequency may have different amplitudes and phases. Now let's see a picture of that. So let's grab a picture here, and we'll pull up slide number 1. You're going to see a bunch of sounds here. I'll pull it up and make it even more bigger. Okay? Look at the top sound where my cursor is. That's some frequency, that's some amplitude. Then look at panel B, another frequency, same amplitude but higher frequency. Then look at panel C, you've got a higher frequency yet because you've got more cycles taking place, but smaller intensity. Whatever, these are just 3 random sounds, and you take A plus B plus C and you stick them together and you got D. Now look at D. It's a jagged, but you can still see some pattern to it, can't you? There's still a rhythm to it. There's still kind of a repetitive pattern to it. And that means that the sound is going to be tonal. It's going to sound like, it's going to sound tonal. It's a mixture of a few different frequencies, but because the waveform repeats over time, it's still tonal. Any wave, A, B, C, or D, that shows repetition over time is going to sound tonal. It might be low tone, might be mid tone, might be high tone, but by gum, it's going to be tonal. All right. So now I'm going to escape out of there, back to our notes. Second little paragraph here, right where my cursor is. Complex sounds may be periodic or non-periodic. Okay? Periodic means they repeat over time. Non-periodic, they don't repeat over time. And just for fun, if you want to look at a sound that doesn't repeat over time, let's pick one out here and I'll go to it. Oh, slide on down here and we'll just look at a sound that has absolutely nothing over time. Look at this guy here. Look at that sound wave on the left. I see no pattern in that at all. That's not repetitive over time. It's not periodic. And what would you call that? That's a complex sound, but it's called noise. Noise is when the sound isn't periodic. Periodic means the sound has some tonality to it, and non-periodic or aperiodic means the waveform has no repetition over time. It's just like some random, and that's called noise. Okay, just a little definition for you. Back home now, look at the top here and compare. Look at the repetitive pattern over there. Okay, back to our notes. Until now, we've discussed pure tones. All pure tones hardly even exist in nature. They're produced in labs and by audiometers. All simple sounds, pure tones, are, of course, periodic. But the only time we really hear pure tones is when you're listening under headphones in a hearing test. Because even when you're playing music, the twang of a guitar string, or when you're blowing through a trumpet or a clarinet, you've got lots of different frequencies happening at the same time. We rarely at all hear pure tones. Almost all the time, we're hearing complex sounds that are mixtures of pure tones and also noise. Some sounds are a mixture of both. And just to give you a heads up of where we're going, I'll stop sharing, so you got to look at me here. In speech, you've got tonality from the throat. Your vowels are tonal. A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. Those are tonality. They are loud, and they're fairly low-pitched. They're all hovering around 250 hertz, 500 hertz, maybe 1,000, but that's it. That's where they stop. And then you want to know some noises of speech, the stuff that isn't tonal. Think of your consonants. Letter S, S, sh, k, ch, t, all the lip sounds. Those are aperiodic. Those are pops and fizzes. Literally, they're like, they're just. So speech is a unique combination of tonality and noises, of periodic sound waves and non-periodic sound waves. Just thought I'd tell you, it's a heads up as to where we're going with this section. So now we'll read again in our notes. All right, spectrum versus sound waves for representing complex sounds. I remember showing you a spectrum way back in Unit 1, and I said in a few weeks we're going to pass this way again. Well, now we're passing this way again. You've got two ways to represent sound. One's a sound wave, and the other one is a spectrum. So let's look first at a sound wave and then contrast that to a spectrum. These are sound waves. Okay? Whoops. Where's my lovely PowerPoint slide? Strange how that just disappeared. Let's go home. Okay. Here's the sound waves. What are the axes of a sound wave? Horizontal is time, and the vertical is amplitude. Okay? Horizontal, time, vertical, amplitude. Now look at a spectrum. Here's a spectrum. Okay? You've got horizontal is frequency, and the vertical is amplitude. Now, why do we have two different ways of representing sound? Because sound takes place over 3 dimensions: frequency, intensity, and time. And yet, a piece of paper only has 2 dimensions, length and width. So we've got to use 2 different kinds of graphs to show you all 3 dimensions of sound. Okay? So in the beginning here, you can look at sound waves. And yes, you can talk about wavelength, and you can talk about period of sound, but we're looking at sound waves, and this is time, and this is amplitude. And when you're looking at a spectrum, this is frequency, and this is amplitude. Amplitude is spoiled. It's shown twice, and it's always on the vertical axis. Now look at this spectrum, and we'll look at some of its characteristics. It's saying that this complex sound that I'm circling has many different frequencies. In fact, it's got 10 different frequencies, and it's showing you exactly which ones: 100 hertz, 200, 300, 400, and you can also see that the amplitude is dropping. It doesn't have to, they're just showing you a spectrum, and this spectrum of a complex sound happens to drop off as the frequencies get higher. So it's got more energy in the low pitches and less amplitude in the high pitches. And that, by the way, BTW, is the same as the frequencies of speech. Speech is a lot like this spectrum. Speech has more energy in the low frequencies and less energy in the high frequencies. So when you say the word speech, what part of the word speech is the loudest? And it's going to be the E. If I say the word church, what parts of the word church are the loudest? It's the okay? And the ch is softer and high-pitched. Anyway, if you look at a spectrum, you can think of it as a slice. And I'll go to the first slide here again. Here's the first slide. Look at the bottom wave. Let's call that a loaf of bread. Okay, the bottom wave, from left to right. This is one bum of the bread, and here's the other bum of the bread. Okay, now let's say you took a knife, and let's follow my cursor here and cut. Let's cut this wave. Cut it. If I cut a wave and then turn it this way, okay, now you'll see the fingers. Now you see my spectrum. Okay? I'll be really silly here. This is a church. This is a steeple. Open up the doors and see all the people. Okay? Literally, when you think of a sound wave, think of it as a loaf of bread. And then if you want to see the spectrum, cut the loaf of bread and turn it this way so you can see all the different frequencies inside. Literally, a spectrum is often called a spectral slice. It doesn't have time. Time is not represented in a spectrum. It's a slice of a sound wave, and you're turning it sideways and looking at the pieces. Okay? That's literally the long and short of it, the two different ways. So back to our good old notes again. And the notes. Spectrum versus sound waves for representing sounds. Each has limitations because they each show only two dimensions of sound. Sound takes place, as we recall, in frequency, intensity, and time. Sound waves, waveforms, the axes are x-axis is time, the horizontal or the vertical is amplitude. These are good at showing tiny changes in the sound over time. So look at our picture here. Look at the bottom wave. You can see it, what's happening over time, but if you look at that bottom wave and I said, well, what's the frequency there? You'd be going, I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to figure it out. You know, you'd have to kind of do some math and some measurements, I guess, to figure out what's the frequency here. First of all, you'd need to know what the time was. And then you'd need to do what they call a spectral analysis in order to find out what the frequencies are. And there was a guy who lived in a van down by the river, and his name was Monsieur Fourier, F-O-U-R-I-E-R, a Frenchman, Fourier. And this is in the 1700s. And Fourier was experimenting with sound. And he took a bell, a great big bell from a church, and went gong, and the bell was gong. And Monsieur Fourier said to himself, I'll bet you there's many different frequencies in that sound from the bell. So he hung a bunch of tuning forks from a string. And some tuning forks were low-pitched, and some tuning forks were high-pitched. So he took a whole bunch of these guys, long ones, shorter ones, and shorter ones, a whole bunch of tuning forks, okay? And he hung them upside down on a string, and he hung them right by when he bang with the bell, and all those tuning forks were hung on a string, and he listened to see which tuning forks were vibrating as a result of that bell. And some tuning forks were vibrating, and some tuning forks were not. So he said to himself, that bell has this tuning, that's this frequency in it, doesn't have that one, it's got this frequency in it, doesn't have that one, it's got this. He did a Fourier analysis. He took a complex sound from a bell that was gong, hung a bunch of tuning forks that are tuned to specific frequencies, and he listened to see which ones resonated, which ones are going due to the sound of the bell. And in an old-fashioned way, that's like what they call a spectral analysis. And you can also call that a Fourier analysis. So a Fourier analysis means breaking down a complex sound to find out what the individual components are. Fourier analysis, also known as a spectrum. Okay? All right, we're getting someplace here. Share screen, back to the notes. Cool. All right, so a spectral analysis on this particular sound that I'm circling at the bottom of the screen here may very well yield a spectrum that could look like this. Who knows? Okay. All right. There's many different kinds of spectrum. Look at the spectra. Look at this. The first one, the top one, is showing you a flat spectrum. That's often called a white spectrum. It's got all the different frequencies at the same amplitude. A wide, broadband spectrum. And notice that there's no vertical lines in it. There's no up and down little bars like there were here. That's because this is showing you a discrete spectrum, showing you it's got this frequency, this frequency, this frequency. It doesn't have any in between. It's got this one, this one, this one. Whereas this next picture says this spectrum has all the different frequencies in it. And I'm not going to sit there drawing a million lines. Okay, it's got everything from here to here. So that's called a spectral envelope. And for the top one, it might be for what you call white noise. White, and why do they call it white? The interesting thing about that is, think about colors. Remember when you were a kid, maybe in school, and your teacher had you draw a pie, and one triangle of the pie was red, and another one was green, and another one was yellow, and another one was blue, and another, and spin that thing really fast, and what will you see? White. White is all the colors put together. So white noise contains all different frequencies from low to mid to high, and they're all of equal intensity. White noise. I guess you could think of it, put your radio between stations. White noise. Okay? Now if I look at a spectrum over here at the bottom of the page, look at the bottom one. That couldn't be called white noise. That spectrum has everything in it as well, but all the different frequencies are not of the same intensity. The low frequencies here don't have as much amplitude, whereas the high frequencies have much more amplitude. So I guess this noise, you can't call it white. I don't know, maybe you'd call it yellow, who knows, but you'd call it different. And if I imitated what this one would sound like, perhaps it might sound like, and if I imitated what this bottom one might sound like, it might be, you see, noises can also sound different. You can have, okay, those are all non-tonal. Their waveforms do not show repetition, but they still have all kinds of frequencies in them. It's just that when you put them all together, there's no repetition that you can see in the wave. And so it's not going to sound tonal, but still the noises can sound different. Okay, back to the notes. Sound waves are great for showing tiny changes over time, but it's difficult to pick out specific frequencies from a sound wave. A complex sound wave is kind of difficult. Look at the bottom one. You'd be hard-pressed to find out what frequencies are in there unless you did a spectral analysis or a Fourier analysis. Good. Many sounds are mixtures of both tonality and noise. For example, speech. Vowel and voiced consonants of speech are examples of tonal sounds that also have noise. Circle those two words, vowels and voiced consonants. We'll take a little bit of speech language pathology here. This is what speech therapists study, because they study the nature of speech. So here goes. Let's take a of an unvoiced consonant. That means a consonant that's not using your throat. Let's take the letter F. Put your hand to your throat and say, you can't feel your throat when you do that, can you? But now, do it again with a voice. You just made a V. A V is a voiced F. Let's take the letter P. Now put a voice in. B. You have P, put a voice in it, you got a B. B. Serious? Take the letter T. Put a voice in. What do you get? D. You have a D. Told ya. Real weird. Let's do a letter S. Now put a voice in. Z. You have a letter Z. In Canada, we call it a Z. Zorro. Okay? So you've got voiced and unvoiced consonants. Voiced consonants are using the throat. Because they are using the throat, there is some tonality to it. In other words, they're a mixture of noise and tonality. Whereas unvoiced consonants have no tonality to them. They are simply noises. Okay, look at all the weird kinds of complex sounds you can get. All righty. All righty mighty. Now let's keep reading here. Frequency spectrum. Axes are frequency on the X or horizontal, and amplitude once again on the vertical or Y-axis. Spectra are great at showing you specific frequency components of complex sounds. They're great at showing you exactly what's in the sound, but you can't see any changes over time. So if I go here, what changes over time are you seeing there? That's just a slice. It's not telling you jack about what's taken place over time. To do this, you simply took a slice of a sound wave and turned it sideways so you could see the individual frequencies. So think of sound waves or waveforms as a loaf of bread. Think of spectra as slices turned sideways so you can see the raisins. Line versus continuous spectrum. Well, a line spectrum is going to be this. These are line spectra. It's showing you discrete individual frequencies. Continual spectra are like these. It's got everything under, but they don't want to draw a million different lines. Okay? Line versus continuous spectra. French, Fourier, mathematical analysis. We talked about that. And now we get to this, fundamental frequency. The fundamental frequency is the lowest frequency in a complex sound. The lowest frequency in a complex sound. Notice in this complex sound that all the other frequencies are equal multiples of the fundamental. So the fundamental here is 100 hertz, and all the other ones are called harmonics. Harmonics in acoustics means equal multiples of the fundamental. So in this kind of a complex sound, all the harmonics are equal multiples of the fundamental frequency. So now let's distinguish the difference between harmonics and octaves. Very important. Let's do that. 100 hertz. What's the next harmonic? 200 hertz. It's also 1 octave higher because when you go up an octave, you double the frequency. Go to the next harmonic. It's 300 hertz. Is that an octave higher? No, I didn't double the frequency. Go up another octave or another harmonic. Now I'm at 400 hertz. Now I'm at another octave because 200 times 2 is 400. What's going to be the next octave? 800. What would be the next octave? 1600. Okay? When you double the frequency, you go up an octave. The difference, harmonics are different. They are simply equal multiples of the fundamental. Okay? Just this distinction between harmonics versus octaves. Back to your notes. All right. Waveform and spectra for 3 kinds of bizarre, complex, periodic sound waves. Whoa. Before we do that, let's just kind of look at some strange, just to kind of highlight a couple of things. Let's look at this picture here, slide 18. This is showing you 3 complex sounds. You've got 3 different spectrums, 3 spectra, to speak in better English. 3 different spectra here. A, B, and C. Notice they all have the same fundamental frequency. They all have 300 hertz. And notice they all have identically the same harmonics. 600, 900, look at how they're multiples of the fundamental. If the fundamental is 300, the next harmonic is 6, the next one's 900, the next one's 1200. They are equal multiples of the fundamental. All 3 sounds have this. What makes them different is that the amplitudes are different. So follow my cursor here. The amplitudes are different across the frequency. So identical harmonics, identical fundamental frequencies, yet different sounds. One might be a trumpet, one might be a clarinet, one might be an oboe, I don't know. The point is, notice how they have different resonances. This one has a resonance here, and then it doesn't here, and then it has another resonance here. The middle one has a little resonance here, and then another little resonance here, and then another little resonance here. And the bottom one great big resonance here, and then down, and then another larger resonance here. This is what's going to give the instruments different timbre, different quality. Each instrument may have different mass and stiffness properties. And because of its different mass and stiffness properties, it's going to resonate at different frequencies. And you can see that in the spectral analysis. Okay, so we're kind of broaching on a topic that we covered a couple of weeks ago, only we're doing it again from the concept of complex sounds. So if I stop sharing for a second and think about a trumpet. You're blowing in a trumpet. And what do you do when you blow into a trumpet? Your lips are really tight and you're going, you're doing that, okay? That's the fundamental frequency. How many times your lips are flapping up and down per second. That's going to be your fundamental frequency. And then the horn has its resonance because of due to its mass and its stiffness. It's going to, and the spectral analysis of sound is going to show you different resonances. And if I make it a clarinet, a different shape, I might have the very same fundamental frequency of my lips, but the harmonics are going to have different amplitudes. And so it's the same thing with when you're blowing, when you're into a thing that has a reed, an instrument that has a reed to it that actually vibrates. That's the fundamental frequency. And then the harmonics arise due to the shape of the instrument through which you are blowing the air. So it's all doo-dee-doo-doo. Thought I'd tell you. Okay. All right. Back to our notes. Stick to Snickers here. All right. I'm going to talk just briefly about waveforms and spectra for 3 really bizarre sounds, just for the fun of it. We're going to make some complex sounds here. And then we can kind of exit stage left. But let's just do this for the heck of it. You're going to see a wave that's called a square wave, a triangular wave, a sawtooth wave. And let's check those puppies out. Let's see what's going down here. So we'll move on down here and add a few different strange looking waves. For example, look at the top wave. It's a sound wave of some frequency, and I guess they're going to call it 200 hertz. Then they're adding another frequency, and it's going to be 400 hertz. Then you're adding a third one at 600 hertz, and a fourth one at 800 hertz. You stick them together, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and you've got a spectral analysis showing you 4 different frequencies. And look at the weird looking sound wave at the bottom. Now I'll ask you, is that repetitive? Yeah. So is it going to sound tonal? Yep. Is it noise? Nope. Okay? It's not. What's really weird is if you've got this sound wave here that we just took from the bottom there, take that sound wave and take away frequency number 1. So now you're missing frequency number 1. And now the sound wave is going to look a little bit different. The effect of removing the fundamental frequency. Still repetitive, but you've changed the nature of the sound a little bit. You've took away the fundamental frequency. So this is just to highlight that you can make and break sounds. Now look at the triangular wave, or this is a sawtooth. Looks just like a sawtooth. Okay, a complex periodic sound wave that is called a sawtooth wave because its shape resembles the teeth of a saw. How did you make these guys? Well, they took a sound wave 1, and then they added this one to it, and now you've got a complex sound made of sound 1 and sound 2. Then they added a third one to it, so now you have a complex sound made of sound 1 plus sound 2 plus sound 3, and you keep on adding in a certain way. In other words, you keep adding in a certain way and keep reducing the amplitude according to a certain rule, and your wave is going to look more and more like a sawtooth. You keep going, it's really going to look like a sawtooth. And here's the rule. I guess if you had the fundamental frequency here and you added harmonics, that dropped off at this rate. That would be the rule for making a sawtooth wave. Okay. Amplitude spectrum of a sawtooth wave. Amplitude spectrum of this. You did a spectral analysis of it. You got this. Okay. Let's look at another wave, a square wave. Sound number 1, sound number 2, sound number 3, sound number 4. And you got these guys here, and you're adding and adding and adding and adding, and finally the wave is starting to look more and more like a square wave. Little Jack Horner sat in the corner and got a square bum. Okay, look what's happening here. You're making a square wave. Summation of sine waves to form complex waves. The sine waves at the left, S1 through S4, are added progressively to form the complex waves C1 through C3 at the right. At the bottom, a square wave is actually created by summation of an infinite number of these sine waves at appropriate amplitudes, frequencies, and starting phases. Let's look at the spectral analysis of a square wave. Look at this. They're not putting in every harmonic. It's every other harmonic. And it's still dropping off at a fast rate, but it's every other harmonic. Compare that to here. You're having the same drop-off rate, but you're having every other harmonic. Weird. Here's a triangular wave. Okay? And it too is made up in a certain rule. Look at how they make a triangular wave. They make it really drop off. And then you're using every other harmonic. So people experiment and make these sound waves, and it's kind of interesting. So here you go, adding sinusoids to make a triangular wave according to a certain rule. Look at that, you've got to really drop the amplitudes. You've got to get higher and higher in frequency, adding certain harmonics and making them really drop off in intensity. So here's a sawtooth wave on the left, and here's its amplitude spectrum. Here's a square wave on the left, and here's its amplitude spectrum. See how they drop off at the same rate? But this one here is every other harmonic. And then look at this, you got all these different rules. Waveform, spectrum. Don't worry about the right one. The right side I couldn't care less. Just look at this column here and this column here. Sawtooth, it has its weird spectrum. Square wave, it has, look at the drop-off is the same, but every other harmonic. Triangular, every other harmonic, but the drop-off rate is faster. And then look at white noise. Look at its sound wave, and look at its spectrum. See how it's a continuous spectrum? Instead of showing a line spectrum of individual frequencies, it's got all frequencies underneath at an equal intensity. So there's all kinds of stuff. Now we can go to the bottom of our page, and please don't think you have to memorize this, because I couldn't care less. Just talking about how complex sounds can be made and created in a lab to make some really strange forms. But if you look at this one here, the speech waveform from the larynx actually looks a bit like a sawtooth wave. Actually, what's the sound from our throat? Kind of like a sawtooth, a little bit more like a sawtooth than a triangular wave. And it has all the harmonics. And then guess what? You'd think it would have a whole lot of low frequency energy, don't you? Because it's dropping off. You would think that the sound wave from your throat, because it drops off, it has a lot more energy at the vowels and very little in the high frequencies. Well, we got a little bit of something to counteract that drop off. Let me show you. I'm getting a piece of paper, and I'm taking this piece of paper, and I'm going to roll it up like a horn. So now it's rolled up like a horn. Narrower on one end, wider on the other end. And when I speak into the horn, can you hear the high frequencies of my speech? You can hear the letters S, F, T, H. Mind you, if I talk into the back of the horn like this, my speech is more muffled. But if I speak like this, you can hear the high frequencies more. Your mouth is like a horn. Your throat is narrow, but your mouth gets wider. And all horn-shaped objects tend to emphasize high frequencies. Did you know that? That's the same thing in hearing aids. What they used to do for hearing aids to amplify treble was they made the tube that went into the ear, they made it flared out a bit like a horn, because it tends to amplify treble. Lots of stuff you're going to learn in this study. All we're doing here is learning the physics and some acoustics here that you can apply later on to hearing aids. But ordinarily, all I'm telling you is that the sound of the throat would be a lot like a sawtooth wave that would drop off like crazy. But then again, you got a little bit of counteraction against that with the horn effect of the face. So you still have a drop off, but instead of being like 12 dB per octave, it's about 6 dB per octave. And that's the roll-off of speech. Vowels are louder than consonants, yep. So vowels are here, consonants are here, but the drop-off isn't like this. The drop-off, because of the horn effect of the face, instead of having a real big drop-off, it's kind of counteracted a little bit. The sound of speech is a lot like, if we wanted to talk about a noise, the sound of speech is a little bit of what we call pink noise. I'll show you. Pink noise. Pink Okami, okay? He's gone so far left, he's left America. Whoa, I don't want to do that. I just want to move down the page. So let's look at pink noise. Okay, check this out. Okay, let's go to, here we go. There you go. Showing you a spectrum of white noise and showing you a spectrum of pink noise. White noise, flat spectrum. It's got all the different energy, all the different frequencies at an equal amplitude, just like white is all colors together. Well, if you stay in keeping with the color analogy, what is the lowest frequency color? And you think of that as infrared. Red. If you looked at light waves, red is the lowest frequency. If you look at light waves, what's a high frequency? Ultraviolet. And that's what a rainbow has. Everything from red to green to yellow, to then you start getting into the blues, and then you get ultraviolet. Okay, that's why they call, when they talk about spectra of noise, they use a color analogy. White noise, because white is the presence of all colors together, white noise has what they call a flat spectrum, like what I'm drawing here. Pink noise has the same energy in the lows, but it drops off in the highs. So pink noise has a lower frequency spectrum. So if white noise sounded like, pink noise would sound like, okay? So if they're making a noise spectrum to imitate the spectrum of speech, they often use pink noise. And I can show you the spectrum of speech. Bet you dollars to donuts I got that puppy in here. I sure hope I do. It'd be nice if I did. There we go. Let's look at the spec. Here it is. Spectrum of average conversational speech. Don't worry so much about the top dotted line and the bottom dotted. Just look at the solid one. More energy in the low frequencies because that's where the vowels are. All sounds made from the larynx. Okay, and by the way, larynx, never call it a voice box again. Okay, it's a larynx. L-A-R-Y-N-X. Larynx. That's your voice. Next week we'll be talking more about how that works. It's fascinating how the voice, the larynx, actually works. We'll talk more about that next week, but you can see that the spectrum of average conversational speech is more like pink noise. It's got more energy in the lows, and then it drops off in the high frequencies. Just something to keep in mind that way. Bottom of your page here, beats. Now, I hate beets, the kind you eat. Those purple things, gag, especially when they're pickled. I won't touch the darn things. Well, don't like beets very much. Never did. Anyway, but that's B-E-E-T-S. This is B-E-A-T-S. Beats. If you add two tones that are far apart in frequency, you will get a complex sound of two distinct frequencies. Duh. Okay. You can tell a complex sound right away when you see anything other than a pure tone sinusoid. If you see any wave that's starting to look jagged or bumpy, even if it repeats over time, you know it's a complex sound. For example, if you're looking up here and you're looking, oh, let's say, where were we here? Let's go to this tone. Here. Okay. You're looking at this sound, or you're looking at this sound, you know they repeat over time, so they're periodic, and because the sound waves are not pure, what do you call it? They're not, this is a pure tone, this is a pure tone, this is a pure tone, okay? But those are single frequencies. When you add things together, you get these odd-looking waves, and you can tell by looking at the wave, it's got to be a complex sound. Because it's not purely up and down, up and down. It's got up, chicka 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 down, up, chicka 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 down, up, chicka 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 down. I mean, it's just this weird looking wave, but yet it's tonal because it repeats over time. Okay? Now when we start to look at the word beats, when adding two sinusoids together that are close in frequency, the whole wave envelope is going to show up and down amplitude increases. I'll show you what that looks like. Very different. Okay? So when you start getting into adding frequencies close together, you're going to see something that looks like what they call this. Look at this. Wow, wow, wow. So the wave is actually, it's going up and down like bumps, like beads on a necklace. Whoa, 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 whoa. If you add 1,000 hertz to a 1,001 hertz tone, you're going to have 1 hertz different, aren't you? And you're going to hear 1 beat per second. If you play the two tones together, you're going to hear whoa, 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 whoa. If you take a 1,000 hertz tone and you add it to a 1,002 hertz tone, you have 2 hertz difference. You're going to hear whoa, 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 2 beats per second. Take a 1,000 hertz tone and a 1,005 hertz tone, you've got 5 hertz difference. you're going to hear 5 beats per second. Okay? You think about it like, have you ever sat on a bus and looked at the windshield wipers of a bus? Now, if you're in a car, your windshield wipers are doing this. But not a bus. I don't know what it is about city buses, but they have 2 different motors on their windshield wipers. So they're going like this. Whoa, 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 whoa. All of a sudden they're out of phase completely, and you keep watching, and finally they'll come back and they'll be totally in phase. But because they're a little bit of a different speed, eventually you're going to get this again. Okay? And that's what I mean by beats. When you take 2 tones that are close together in frequency, they will mesh together, and for a while they'll be in phase, and that'll be the row, and then for a split second they'll be out of phase, and that's the dip. Okay? If you add 2 tones that are very different in frequency, you'll see 2 totally different sound waves. But if they're close together, the waves are going to have that beaded looking formation, and you will hear what they call beats. So let's read here what we got in our notes. When adding 2 simple pure tones that are close to each other in frequency, the whole wave envelope shows amplitude increases and decreases over time. Phases of the individual frequencies at times add together and at times cancel each other out. The result looks like a single tone with an amplitude that increases and decreases. Beats occur at a rate of frequency 2 minus frequency f. If frequency 2 is 1001 hertz and frequency 1 is 1000 hertz, the beats are going to occur at 1001 minus 1000 equals 1 beat per second. If the tones are 1005 and 1000, the beats are going to occur with 5 beats per second. Beats, the tones that are too close together for the frequency resolution of the cochlea to separate them. When you start getting separated by about 20 hertz or more, then you'll start hearing 2 separate tones. So we'll see if you look here, 2 tones that are separate in frequency. I'll draw it a little bit closer, bring it closer to you. So these 2 tones are very far apart in frequency. So the combined sound wave is going to look like this. Whereas if I look at the bottom spectra, you can see the tones are really close in frequency. And when they're close in frequency, you're going to see beats. That's all I mean by beats. When sounds get to be far enough apart, we start to be able to resolve them. When they're really close together, we can't resolve the 2. We start hearing beats. Okay. Spectrum of 3 complex sounds, and this is where what I showed you earlier, right here. Now you're at this slide. Spectra of 3 complex sounds. In the notes, note how they all have the same frequencies, same fundamental frequency of 300 hertz, but the amplitudes of each harmonics are different. They thus have different resonances, which gives different quality of sound. Recall, resonance is the favorite vibrating frequency of an object due to its mass and stiffness properties. They all have different mass and stiffness properties, so certain harmonics are emphasized in amplitude. In musical instruments, the reed or lips determines the fundamental frequency. The mass and stiffness of the instrument determines the amplitude of each harmonic. Recall, resonance is influenced by impedance. Put a star by this. Opposition plus resistance. See, we're coming past this pathway again. We were here 2 weeks ago. Now you're looking at it again. Opposition due to mass and opposition due to stiffness are called reactants. I'll stop sharing and just talk a little bit of history here. Think of a locomotive, of a train. It's got a lot of mass. You can't jiggle a locomotive. You can't make a locomotive go, okay? It's got mass and it doesn't like being wiggled, hates it. So it's going to take 100 people pushing, and then 100 people pulling, and 100 people pushing, but by gum, it's going to be slow. Mass resonates with low frequencies. Mass opposes highs. Similarly, stiffness. If you have your buddy stand there with a stiff hand, if I keep my hand as stiff as I possibly can here, and I try to push up on my hand slowly, and then push down on my hand slowly, it runs into a lot of opposition. But if I grab my fingertips, hold this hand still, and jiggle it, no problem. If I push down slowly, raise slowly, lots of opposition. Jiggle it, no problem. Stiffness resonates with highs. Stiffness opposes lows. And that opposition due to mass and opposition due to stiffness, that's the frown. If you flip it upside down, you got the smile of resonance. So impedance and resonance work together. What isn't impeded resonates. What doesn't resonate is impeded. Okay? And the whole big word is called impedance. And impedance is comprised of opposition due to mass, opposition due to stiffness, plus the friction of the object, which is called resistance. And in any object, the resistance to the passage of sound is equal for all frequencies. But in any object, the mass, the opposition due to mass, controls the frequencies completely. So mass and stiffness, the opposition thereof is very, very frequency dependent. Obviously, mass opposes highs and stiffness opposes lows. But the resistance in any object to the passage of sound is equal for all frequencies. So back to that hairy little set of notes there where we were, right what I'm talking about. I repeat this stuff because this is the kind of stuff that's on quizzes, okay? Opposition due to mass and stiffness of an object is sometimes called reactance. Reactance determines the favorite vibrating frequencies that will most easily pass through it. Mass allows lows to get through, stiffness allows more highs to get through. So reactance is thus very frequency dependent. Resonance occurs, we said 2 weeks ago, when the mass reactance equals the stiffness reactance. That's a picture out of your textbook, right here. Okay, figure 116. Resonant frequency occurs when the impedance due to stiffness is equal to the impedance due to mass. That's the resonant frequency of an object. Impedance equals reactance plus resistance. Basically, impedance is the flip side of resonance. And to finish today, to finish this determines a filtering action. In other words, look at these three horns again. Okay? These sounds resonate and get through, and this sound here is filtered out. It doesn't get through very much. This sound gets through, and then this one is filtered out again. Think of a filter bag in your vacuum cleaner. A filter bag is going to catch the dirt. Air is going to go through the filter, but it's going to catch the dirt. Filters do the same thing in sound. Okay, any object is going to filter sound. It's going to impede, that means filter. Okay, it's going to stop some sounds from getting through, and it's going to resonate with other sounds. So what isn't impeded gets through. What doesn't kill you makes you tougher. Okay, a bouncer at a bar. He's only letting the women in right now. The men can't come in. The men are filtered out. So when you think about objects as filters, you can think about objects as being low-pass filters, high-pass filter. Look at the bottom, look at the top one. Here's a low-pass filter. It's letting the lows get through. It's cutting off the highs. That's why they call it low-pass. And the second one here is a high-pass filter. It's letting the highs get through. It's cutting off the lows. And the middle one, you can call that a bandpass filter. It's letting the mids get through, but it's not letting the lows and the highs get through. And then you can look at this guy here. It's a notch filter. It's letting everything get through except these guys. Now I can give you an example of a notch filter. Look at the bottom one. Many notch filters cut out 60 hertz. You know why? Because electricity in wires runs on 60 hertz. Hospital equipment, heart monitors, brainwave equipment, CAT scans, MRIs, all kinds of medical equipment uses a 60 hertz notch filter. It cuts out the hum of the electrical circuit. They want everything getting through, but not 60 hertz, a notch. Okay? 4 different types of filters. You can think of them as 4 different kinds of resonances or whatever, doesn't matter. It's what allows sound getting through, and it impedes other sounds. A low-pass filter means the lows are getting through, the highs ain't. A high-pass filter means the highs are getting through, the lows ain't. A band-pass filter means a certain band is getting through, but nothing below and nothing higher. And a notch is the opposite of a bandpass. Everything's getting through except what's in the notch. And so you've got many different kinds of filters in our lives. I mean, here, when I showed you this, musical instruments act as filters. Here, let me go back. There. This sound is getting through. This one's filtered out. This one's getting through. This one's filtered out. So things act as band pass filters. There's a band pass here. There's a band pass here. There's a big band pass here and a littler band pass there. Concepts to think about. How I will finish today is hearing loss acts intellectually in a weird way like a filter. Elderly people who have hearing loss, what do they have trouble hearing? Treble. They have trouble hearing treble. Because they've got trouble with treble, their hearing loss, in a weird way, in quotes, is acting like a low-pass filter. It's letting the lows go through, but it's cutting off the highs. Now, it's not doing that to its mass and stiffness. I'm just giving you an analogy here, okay? But hearing aids, as an analogy, to keep with the analogy, hearing aids need to take that frown and turn it upside down. Hearing aids are usually treble emphasis. Okay? And I'm just speaking analogically here. All right. I think we've done enough acoustics for one day. We'll go back to complex sounds next week. All right? Good stuff. Hey, did we have any trouble with the internet? I think it stayed stable today, didn't it?
It looked good today, yeah.
Hey, good old Ethernet cable. I went to the store and bought one the other day. What the hey? Enough on that. Okay, catch you in about an hour.
Okay. Thanks.